welcome again. First session of today is going to be about reducing latency on the web with the Azure CDN. Has anyone of you tried the CDN already? Anyone no idea what the CDN may be? Come on, something. Yes, okay. Just to make sure that you're not watching soccer on your cell phone. All right, so the session is going to be an introduction to the Azure CDN, what you can do with it. And before I dive into what you can do with it and how you can do something with it, I do want to give you a little bit of background on why you may want to have a CDN in place in your solution. Let's quickly introduce myself. I'm Maarten Bayo. I live in Antwerp, so not too far from here. Technical evangelist at JetBrains during the day, operator and developer and marketeer and whatever on MyGate by night. Also one of the people behind Azure, so if you have any feedback, do feel free to send me an email or talk to me afterwards on Azure and what we are doing. I try to focus on web, and web is a broad thing. Web is basically everything that runs in a browser or requires HTTP to operate. So that's ASP.NET MVC, jQuery, Azure, Singular, everything that's not WinForms or .pf, because I really don't like that one. And since someone sometime mentioned that SharePoint is also web, also not SharePoint. But big passion, of course, is Windows Azure. I try to blog on those things. I also try to rant occasionally on my blog as well. And I do the same thing on Twitter. And since I've stopped doing consultancy, you will find less and less complaining about traffic on my Twitter account. So there's actually something more than noise on there as well. All right, the agenda. Why use a CDN? I think it makes sense to cover why you may want to use a CDN. And there's a couple of, I thought, researching the topic, surprising ideas why you want to do this. Then we'll cover the Azure CDN. We'll use the CDN on top of blob storage and on cloud services. And then we will look into one of the use cases that I think are pretty interesting, which is serving dynamic content over the CDN. So why use a CDN? Whenever you do a request with your browser, whenever you visit a website or whatever, what your browser will be doing is fetching HTML from the server. That HTML contains references to CSS, to images, to JavaScript, to Google Analytics, to user voice widgets, to whatever you are downloading on there. And those things, in turn, can also have references to other scripts. So, for example, if you see the user voice widget on a website, that's a JavaScript file that's being downloaded, but the JavaScript file inserts some HTML, which in turn downloads some JavaScript as well, and some CSS, and so forth. So there's a lot of data being requested whenever you do an HTTP request to any server or any website out there. Problem with that is that your browser and also your operating system have a finite number of concurrent requests they can perform, both to that one host name, as well as in general across all threads and processes in the browser. So to overcome that limit, a lot of people are currently using bundling and minification and things like that. And some of them are hosting images and CSS on separate domain names so that they come from a different host name and that the browser can download more resources at the same time from multiple hosts. So if you look at all the different browsers that are available, and I think actually IE Mobile 9 is one of the coolest browsers ever because of the connection limit in there. If you look at the browsers, you see that on average, between 6 and 8 connections at the same time to the same host can be made. And in total, it's typically 10 to 15 to 16 to sometimes 20 requests that are being done in general. Which means, if you're familiar with the concept of long polling, where you open an HTTP request to a certain host, keep the connection open until data comes back, and then request again and again and again. If you have 20 of those long polls running concurrently in some of those browsers, you will essentially have no or very slow internet browsing because the browser is being hogged by these different connections to those hosts and all the different hosts. So there's an issue with browsers. Most people using minification and using the different domain name approach can overcome this a little bit and make the request go faster or appear faster when they visit the website. But still, if you look at Twitter, for example, if you go to their website and open the IE tools or use Fiddler or whatever, what you can see is, I don't know if it really zooms in that well, But what you can see is Twitter is also making use of bundling and minification, making use of different domain names to serve specific content, to serve images and CSS and so on. But what you still see is that, for example, for fetching images, I think it's all these requests, it's more than those 6 that my browser supports. So loading this page, and you can actually see that in the timeline as well, loading this page means my HTML is loaded first, then a couple of my images, and when those are loaded, all the rest is being downloaded. So the perceived page load speed of Twitter, for example, will be slower because of these many requests on the same host name. So if they would spread this across more host names, it would download faster and it will feel faster to the end user. Of course, this is seconds or milliseconds, but if you have a lot of resources that are being loaded, imagine navigating to Facebook, to the homepage, with all the different styles, images on there, all the different pictures people are posting on there as well. It's a lot of resources being downloaded, so it actually makes sense to optimize for that. No, it doesn't mean I'm smarter than the guys of Twitter. It means that the guys of Twitter have an awesome designer who requires a lot of images and doesn't use enough spriting there. They'll get it eventually. Another issue with the internet, so browsers are some sort of an issue. Another issue with the internet is speed of light. Okay, you may be wondering, speed of light, what's that for an issue? Well, it is an issue on the internet. Imagine East Coast, West Coast, US. That is about 7,000 kilometers in distance. To travel that distance using speed of light, it would take you 25 milliseconds in raw speed of light. Issue with that is that the connection from east to west will typically not be in a vacuum, but it will be fiber optics. And fiber optics have, according to physics, they have a refraction index, which means the speed of light will be slower inside plastic or glass, which means that those 25 milliseconds, ideally, will take you 37 milliseconds. Now, most providers and most back-end operators on the internet don't have cables spanning east to west. They have east to somewhere in the middle, go to a router, go to a switch, go to a different data center, go to a router, and then go to the other side of the US. So these 37 milliseconds will maybe become 50 milliseconds to travel from east to west. So it takes a little bit of time to do that. Now, of course, that's not really an issue, because in TCP/IP, the maximum packet size can be 64 kilobytes, which is awesome. You can crunch 64 kilobytes in one TCP packet. However, most of those round trips and devices sitting in between do not support this maximum size of TCP packets. Most of them will be limited to 1,500 bytes in total, which means to transfer 64 kilobytes from east to west US, you will have a lot of TCP packets going back and forth between both locations. So speed of light is an issue there, TCP/IP a little bit, but TCP/IP has this nice little concept called slow start. And with TCP slow start, it's actually an optimization inside TCP/IP, which means that whenever you request something from a server, the server will respond with 1 packet. If there's more data to send, it will send you 2. Then it will send 4, then 8, and so on, to basically burst and increase the speed that that data flows through. Now imagine 256 kilobytes going east to west US with those 90 milliseconds that you have in latency with all the different devices, and the fact that every TCP packet also requires an acknowledgement. So in fact it all doubles in speed. Imagine you have that and TCP slow start. That means that for 256 kilobytes that you think would take 90 milliseconds in latency, you will actually spend almost 1 second transferring those 256 kilobytes. Not too much, but imagine having a lot of those. It gets slowly pretty quickly, and if you can reduce that time and make it less, it will go faster. Now, to demonstrate TCP slow start, there's actually a fun thing that I recently discovered. If you're using speed test, I guess you know that. It's like the pissing contest of internet connections. My connection is faster. No, mine is faster. If you use speed test and you wait for the download speed graph to show up, you can actually, it's very vague in this case because this apparently seems to be a very good connection. But you can see this TCP slow start in action, and especially if you use the app on your smartphone, you will see that it really goes up and fills the connection based on this slow start algorithm. So browsers are broken, TCP/IP is broken, and then there's the web. Serving static files from your web server costs CPU, costs I/O. Not too much, but still. And depending on the configuration of your web server, it may actually become a lot of CPU and a lot of I/O being done there. Imagine you have 1 kilobyte PNG on your website, which is like a small icon you want to use on a button somewhere, and you are using Windows Identity Foundation. And you have a nice amount of claims in there that are transported in cookies and so on. What you are doing is perhaps send 5 kilobytes of claims to the server, have the server analyze everything, make sure that you're actually allowed to access this 1 kilobyte PNG file, send you back the PNG file, plus the header containing the cookie again with 5 kilobytes of data. So it's a waste of transport. There's a lot of waste in the cookie being transported, and there's a lot of waste in loading sessions from a database on the server because you're serving on a domain that accepts cookies and sessions. There's a lot of waste on making sure authentication is all right and so on. So ideally, for that type of files, you want to host them on a server that is made for that doesn't have to care about cookies or sessions or whatever, and can just serve you the PNG file without requiring too much header information and without sending back too much header information. So there are some problems on the internet, browsers and connections, speed of light and TCP, and the cost of web load and how we build our applications. And you probably know this guy, Andy Cross. I was chatting with him on Twitter. And he gave me a nice slide that I thought, yes, let's put that in there. The internet sucks, and so does your server. In fact, the internet, it's 20 years old. It works phenomenal for being a technology that's 20 years old, but there are some issues with it. And the internet sucks, and your server as well. But as a good developer, what do we do when there's a problem? Don't solve the problem, find a workaround, right? So there's a couple of workarounds you can do around these browser and connection, speed of light, and so on. In terms of browsers and connections, the answer is pretty simple. Just have multiple host names so you can max out the number of connections your browser supports, and not only the connections per host, so the entire spectrum you want to have there. For speed of light and TCP slow start, there's actually only one solution to overcome that, which is to move the content closer to the user. Imagine that US East to US West round trip we had, which was 90 milliseconds. Imagine bringing down those 90 milliseconds to 10 milliseconds. Transferring that 256 kilobytes file will be fast because it will go from 900 milliseconds down to 100 milliseconds and be much faster. So moving the content closer is the only option for that thing. And then in terms of the cost of web loads, the fact that you have to parse cookies, load sessions, and so forth, there's only one solution, which is move everything off the server that has to do all that and move it to a domain that doesn't require cookies, that doesn't require authentication, and so on. And the Azure CDN is one of the good examples of achieving that workarounds. So the Azure CDN is a service in Azure that allows you to serve content from blob storage or from a cloud service. It gives you a separate host name, which is a very ugly domain name. I will show you in a bit. A custom domain name is possible, but it's still a bit tricky in the current implementation. CDN has many locations around the globe, and using DNS multicast, what they do is bring the content close to the user. So imagine you have a user browsing the internet from Barcelona. They will probably end up on a server in Madrid to download the content. If you're in Belgium, you will probably end up either in Paris or in Amsterdam or in London to download that exact same content, and not on the origin, which may be in the US or in Asia even. So in terms of CDN locations, this is the April 1st version of the map and the list of locations. It's also the current version, so I just checked earlier today and it's still accurate. So there's a lot of locations in the US, a lot of locations in Europe. In fact, in Europe, it's pretty much for every 2 countries there's a CDN endpoint or CDN node serving up content, so that's quite interesting. A couple in Asia, a couple in Australia, but yeah, you see there's clearly some gaps in coverage of the CDN. Now the good thing is, and I'm going to shut off the microphone for a bit. online. So with that, how it works is, imagine you are hosting your application or your data in Dublin, and I see I placed my endpoint there, not in Ireland, but too high up. But imagine that's Dublin, and the geography has changed a little bit. Imagine everything is hosted there. When you have no CDN, and I go on vacation in the south of France, what will happen is I will pay a lot of roaming and connect to the Dublin endpoints to download everything that's there. Now, depending on network, and imagine I'm in a village where I have to go over an ADSL connection to somewhere where they are combining too many connections and it's a slow thing and so forth. It will take a while for me to actually reach that node in Dublin and download the stuff from there. Even though it's not a distance East US, West US, it's still quite some distance, and there's still quite some latency involved in making that connection. And with TCP slow start and so forth, you know this is going to be slower. Now, with the CDN, what will happen is I configure the CDN to expose my origin, which is the place where my stuff is actually hosted. I expose my origin through the CDN. And what will happen is my user will fetch a URL from the CDN. And that URL in that location may route to the CDN endpoint in Spain. And the CDN endpoint in Spain doesn't have a copy of my data yet on the first request. So what will happen is on the first request, the CDN endpoint will fetch the data from my origin, cache it locally, and then send it back to the user. Does this give you a lot of advantage in terms of speed that the end user will have? I don't know. It will depend on the connection of the user. Typically, the pipe between Spain and Ireland will be a little bit bigger than the pipe between your endpoint, or sorry, your device or your laptop and Dublin, but still it depends on your connection. However, the second time you hit the same endpoint, this will be a lot faster. Why? Because the endpoint, the CDN endpoint doesn't have to connect again to Ireland. It will just have the data cached locally and will serve the data locally. Important thing to know here is that using this, the data is only in Spain. It doesn't mean if my data has been fetched on the endpoint in Spain that the data will be available in Paris, in Amsterdam, London, and so forth. It will all depend on which node is being hit by your users. So if you never have users hitting the one in Poland, Poland will be clean and will never contain your data. It all depends on your users and where they are using and consuming your resources from. All right, let's do a quick demo on how you can create such a CDN endpoint. So I'm going to go to the Azure portal, and you can find the CDN endpoint there. And I will zoom in when appropriate. So what I can do is create a new CDN endpoint. I can do a quick create. I can select my subscription, and I can select which origin domain I want to use. So whenever I create a new CDN endpoint, I have to specify, am I going to make use of one of my storage accounts or one of my cloud services? People playing with Azure for a long time may think, if cloud services are in there, my VMs will show up in that list as well, because a VM is just one instance hosted in a cloud service as well. Yes, your VMs show up in here. In fact, 2 of my build servers show up in this list as well, and those are infrastructure as a service. Does it work? Does a CDN work on infrastructure as a service? No, unfortunately not. I've tried this and it doesn't work, so I would like that Microsoft would remove those from the list, but for now they are there. On a side note, no websites as an origin domain yet, and no custom origins as well. I would assume those things are coming at one day in the evolution of the CDN, but I don't know when, I don't know how, but I do hope they will show up eventually. So let's create a CDN endpoint based on my storage accounts. Let's create, and this should go really, really fast. There we go. I now have my CDN endpoint created in the Azure portal. I can go in, and as you can see, I get this really nice URL that I can expose my data through. It's not that nice, but do keep in mind that you can add a custom domain name there as well. So if you click Manage Domains, you can add your custom domain name and link it to the CDN endpoint as well. Thing to note there, this session is all going to be about nodes, because the CDN, as you can see, is just creating it and then you're done with the CDN. Quick thing to note here is when you use a custom domain name and you want to make use of HTTPS, Do know that you cannot change the the SSL certificate of the CDN endpoint, which means if you are using your custom domain name, you will be using an invalid SSL certificate for that domain name because it's based on the ugly URL. So that means if you want to expose your CDN endpoint over HTTPS, you're probably best to use the ugly domain name anyway, because otherwise you will get a lot of people saying, this site is unsafe, and browser warnings and stuff like that. All right, what else can I do? In fact, one of the previous times I did this session, one guy in the audience was like, okay, at the start of the session, is this session going to be about something? Because I've looked at the CDN, and the CDN is basically just 3 checkboxes. Well, CDN is 3 checkboxes. I can enable and disable it, I can enable and disable HTTPS, and I can enable and disable query strings. That's everything you can do through the portal. So yes, the surface area of the CDN in the portal is just 3 checkboxes. All right, so now I have this thing. I'm not going to make use of the CDN endpoints for the rest of the session. Reason for that is it takes about an hour, sometimes 2 hours, for this configuration of the CDN endpoints to propagate to all the CDN endpoints. So it takes a while before the CDN endpoints are provisioned with this information. So I'm just going to make use of one that I created earlier, and to avoid confusion, I will delete this one again. All right, so I have one which is using a blob storage account as the CDN origin. So whenever I navigate to this thing and say demo/helloworld.give, did I upload those? Let's see. It should be there. Too many storage accounts. Demo helloworld.gif. Am I on the right CDN? Should be on the right CDN. So this is, I have the issue. Okay, this was the next thing I was going to tell you. How do I get my files onto the CDN? I made the biggest error ever. Whenever you want to expose your blob storage through the CDN, what you have to do is create a public container. The blobs in your container have to be public, and I just created a private one. So if I change to have blob access as well, I now should be seeing my GIF over the CDN. So I hit the CDN here. The CDN went to my storage account, downloaded the GIF file, and now served it to me. My next refreshes, nothing happens, except the cache from the CDN is being hit. So my blob storage account is not being hit. If I do a trace to the CDN endpoint, we should see where we end up, and that should not be Dublin. I assume it's going to be either Brussels or Amsterdam. But seeing the routing there, it's probably Amsterdam. There's no CDN endpoint in Brussels, no. So if you look at the trace, you can see that we've been in Telnet for a bit, then went to Amsterdam, and then went into this specific network, which I may have told you about, where my data and my CDN endpoint is being served from. So I hit the Amsterdam endpoint. If you have a VPN to a server somewhere in Paris or wherever, you will probably hit the CDN endpoint in Paris. All right, so I have my file there. That's an awesome thing. I can still hit my storage account, works like a charm, and I can also hit my CDN endpoint. Awesome. Cool, so what did we just do? Our first request went to the CDN and then to the blob storage account. Second request on this endpoint just went to the CDN endpoint because the CDN has a cached copy of my data. Now, there's a slight issue there. I have a hello.txt file there as well. Let's open that one. It says hello world, the nicest demo ever. When I download this file, let's say to my desktop somewhere, and open that file, add yeah, then upload that file again. When I now Huh, that shouldn't have happened. All right, let's pretend this thing is not there. Yeah, I think I did hit it. Yeah, whatever. What we should have seen is the initial version should have been served from the CDN endpoint. The reason for that is that the CDN will cache my files for a long, long time unless I do something about this. Keep that in mind because it's something that will be useful during one of the next demos. So how would you use the CDN in real life? Well, what you would do is create one or more public blob containers on your storage account. Doesn't have to be container public, so people can list all the contents. It can be blob public as well, so just the files are available when you know the URL to them. You upload your static files, your CSS, your images, and so on to that blob endpoint, and then you just update your application to make use of those URLs in the application. So if we switch to Visual Studio, no, wrong one, this one. If we switch to Visual Studio and we, I basically just created a file new ASP.NET MVC application here. When we switch to Visual Studio and we edit our layout page, and we say that instead of just using the relative URL to my blob contents, I'm going to use the CDN URL, and let's do that. If I change it to use this, should be quick, and I run my application, I should be using the files that are stored on my CDN endpoint. And I have a package restore, there we go. Application is running, and if everything goes well, I should have a very ugly website. There we are. Reason for that is I didn't upload the files to my CDN or to my blob storage account yet. Why not? Because I wanted to show you one of the approaches how you can do this. If you want to upload your stuff to the CDN, what you can do is write a script, make it part of your continuous integration solution, use PowerShell, use any of the different tools out there to just automatically upload the static content to your blob storage account. What I did in this application, because it's a very simple demo, I created an action method called synchronize, which if I call synchronize, will upload all my static content to blob storage accounts, make sure it's all a public container, and so forth. And once that's done, I should now have a pretty website serving CSS and images from the CDN. Again, no rocket science, but I just want you to know that you can do this automatically. And if you want to do this automatically, the best place to do it is probably somewhere in your CI process, and not like I did in some hidden URL on the website. Now, a couple of things to note in the upload logic. So what I'm doing here, if you know Azure Storage, I'm just connecting to my blob storage account. I'm getting a container reference to my demo1 static container. I'm making sure it exists, and I'm making sure permissions are set so that the blobs in that container are public and they can be served from the CDN. Next thing I'm doing is simply looping all the different files that are in my application. And for every file, I will eventually just get a blob reference and upload it. One special thing I'm doing here, I'm checking the content type of my files. So by default, application/octet stream will be the content type that your files will be stored with in Azure Storage if you just upload them without passing in any specific content type. Some browsers don't mind you doing this. Other browsers will say this is not a PNG image, and they will serve you a raw string of characters that are in your PNG file. So the best thing to do is check the file extension or find some other way to find the right content type and set the content type on the blob's properties. All right. Now, let's see. The second time my demo should work. Let's make a change to something. Imagine I'm working together with Chris on this website, and Chris just came into the office in the morning, and he did a get latest, fetched the latest sources from source control. And just as a nice little joke, what I want to do is in my bootstrap JS file, I want to add this thing. Of course, before production, you want this to go out, but you know it's fun in the team and so on. So let's do that, and let's and let's synchronize again. And if everything goes well and our synchronization is done, and I refresh, nothing happens. My joke failed. Damn. So this is not in production yet. The reason for that is the CDN keeps a copy of your content for a long, long time. Typically, depending on when, what, how, and so forth, it will be somewhere between 3 and 7 days, typically more towards the 7 days time frame. So that means my joke will only be available next week. So yeah, that's an issue. How do I overcome things like this? Because you may want to make changes to the files that you are uploading. You may want to upload new files to the CDN and make them available. How do you overcome this? Well, there's a couple of ways you can do this. One of the things is whenever you are uploading your data, you can set the cache control header of your blob to specify how long the downstream resource or downstream entity may cache your contents. So in a regular browser, this would mean browser cache, you can keep this thing for 1 hour. In CDN, this will mean that the CDN will only cache this file for 1 hour on every node. Which means if I do this and I upload this to my blob storage account, my user in Spain hits the CDN endpoint in Spain. CDN endpoint in Spain gets this header, keeps the data there for 1 hour. 59 minutes later, someone else hits the endpoint in Amsterdam. Amsterdam fetches a copy and also caches that one for 1 hour. Spain will refresh faster than Amsterdam, so make sure that you know this. Make sure that, worst case, your time will double on some of the endpoints in the CDN. It's an important thing to know because you may have strange results if you don't. Now, 1 hour is still long. I would really like to pull my prank right now. So there should be another way to do this, right? Well, that's one of the other checkboxes that you have in the portal. I can go into my CDN, and I can say enable query string. What will happen is if I enable this one, the same thing ASP.NET output caching does will happen on the CDN. So in ASP.NET, you say I want output caching, you vary by parameter, and you say which parameter or all parameters and so on. This is vary by parameter asterisk, so vary by all parameters. Which means for every different URL I give my endpoint, for every different query string, a different copy of my data will be stored on the CDN. So if I want to make sure Chris sees my change, what I can do is simply append something to identify my version number to my URLs. And now, just for the demo, I'm going to only do it for my bootstrap file that I changed. You see it's evening. So what I'm going to do is include a v equals something version number in my URL so that whenever I refresh my page, there it is, I will fetch the version that corresponds to whatever I just deployed to my website. Now, if we look at the sources here, you will see that my version for Bootstrap now is this thing, v equals my version number of my assembly. What you put there, it doesn't really matter. If you want to make this your assembly version, use your assembly version. If you want to make this the date and time of when you deployed, be my guest. If you want to change this every 5 minutes, put a timestamp that expires every 5 minutes and changes every 5 minutes. But put something there. So you have an option or a possibility to refresh the content by just redeploying a fresh version of your HTML that will fetch a fresh version of the CDN. And in fact, if you look at Facebook, for example, in some of their URLs, they are using a version number. Twitter, I've seen they've been using some timestamps and so on, so you can really use whatever you want in that version number there. All right, so how do we delete content from the CDN? That's one of the questions I typically get when talking about the CDN. What I typically say is not. You don't get content of the CDN. You cannot remove content from the CDN. The only thing you can do is either wait until it expires or make sure you are using the cache control header and or a version number in your URL. It's probably best to use both. so that you have a cache and that refreshes whenever you want. But if you have a version number that's really tied to the version of the application you are deploying, maybe you don't need the cache control header, and maybe you want a default of 7 days there. So it all depends on the scenario. Yes. Okay, so if you remove the CDN endpoint, indeed, that will also remove your data from the CDN. Problem with that is, if you do that for a production website, and you have to change the URL, you will have to have provisioned the URL 1 hour before you do the delete, because it takes an hour to spin up a new CDN and make sure that everything is provisioned there. So probably not something you want to do on production. And in development, depending on how much your boss likes you to wait for an hour, I would probably also not do that. But yeah, it's an option. If you really have to delete it, if you put something there that's cached for some reason and that you know, shit, this... there's one which is called disable, and that will disable the CDN endpoint, but it will not kill the cache. So versioning, just put any variable in the URL there, version number, Chuck Norris quotes, whatever you want to identify your resources with. You can put that in the URL, and based on all the different parameters you put in there, there will be a different version on the CDN. Which brings me to another interesting one. I've told you that you should have public containers on the blob storage account to make sure data can be served to your end users. Well, that's a little bit of a lie, because when you enable query strings on the CDN and you make use of shared access signatures, which is this question mark strange signature that allows you to expose blob securely for a given amount of time, you can do that with the CDN as well. So the same signature you would be using on blob storage will work on CDN as well. Do keep in mind, the signature validity will not be the signature validity, it will be the validity of your cache control header. So if you say that this resource should be accessible for 1 minute in your shared access signature, but your cache control header wasn't set, that same signature will be able to be used for 7 days. So your resource will be available for 7 days, even though the signature says it cannot be available for 7 days. The cache is the one that will win in this case. So in such cases, make sure you put the cache control header to something that's actually okay for the blob that you are serving, because otherwise you will get strange or very strange security issues there. If you have a signature that's different for every request, so whenever you have a signature that's valid for 1 minute and every user will get a different signature and so on, it's probably not a good idea to make use of the CDN, because you will simply be having the user hit the CDN, hit your storage account, next user will hit the CDN, hit the storage account, and so on and so on. So in those situations, it's probably not the best idea to make use of the CDN. All right. Until now, we've been uploading stuff manually to a blob storage account, well, manually or during a build or in a special action methods in our MVC application. Probably not the most useful way of doing things. Of course, if you do have a CI in place and you do have a lot of static content that you want to upload that way, be my guest, no issue with that, it will work. But if you're hosting on cloud services, there's actually also a lazy way of getting your stuff on the CDN, which is specifying a cloud service as being a CDN endpoint. One special thing there is if you set a cloud service as a CDN origin, whenever you hit the CDN will hit your cloud service /CDN / the resource that you wanted to access. So if you hit your CDN endpoint saying /demo /hello.txt, it will hit your cloud service on /CDN /demo /hello.txt. So it will go into this /CDN folder. So let's see how we can make use of this. And this time, because in the previous example I've been using the full URLs to my resources, this time I'm going to use bundling and minification. So if you look at my layout.cs.html, what I'm doing here is making use of my CSS and my modernizer bundle, and somewhere down here Bootstrap and jQuery should also be loaded based on the bundles that I've defined in ASP.NET MVC. Is everyone familiar with bundling in MVC? It's pretty simple. It's basically this thing, where I say that for this bundle named jQuery, I want to include all files jQuery.js. For this bundle named Bootstrap, I want to include these two JavaScript files, compress them, minify them, and put them in one resource that can be downloaded. Now, to make use of the CDN, there's a couple of things I can do with bundling and minification. So first of all, I have to specify that I'm using the CDN. Why do I have to do this? Well, when I have a debug configuration, bundling and minification will make use of my local URLs. If I do a release build, bundling and minification will make use of a secondary URL that I can specify. What is that secondary URL? Well, that's one I put in here. So I have a CDN URL, bundles jQuery in there, and that's my secondary URL. What is the CDN URL? Well, again, it's the URL to where my CDN endpoint lives, plus my version. Again, I'm versioning here. I want to make sure that whenever I deploy a fresh version of this application, that my CDN will also be serving the latest files that accompany this deployment. So whenever I do that, and whenever I now run my application, we should be seeing nothing special. It should all work because I'm running locally in a debug configuration. And if you look at the sources here, I'm just making use of my local CSS, my local script files, and so on. Now, I also deployed this one. If you go to, where's my other browser? Azure CDN demo.cloudapp.net. You will see that this, again, is a very, very ugly application. It's the first time I hit this, so it's being compiled. So there we go. If you now look at the sources, what you see is that this secondary URL has been used, and my version number is also being appended there. Okay, nice thing. Problem is, since I told you that you should be serving your files from /cdn and so forth, I didn't configure my application to do that. Hence, the CDN cannot find the files that it's trying to serve here. So there's a couple of ways I can fix that. One is to simply change my local bundles to /cdn/bundles, go to my layout file and also change the URL there, which will mean that all my bundles are being served from this URL. Now, I don't really like this because depending on which plugins for bundling you are using, some relative paths may go wrong in there. I've experienced this a couple of times with, there's one of the plugins, I forget the name, that's basically trying to bring together all the 1 kilobyte PNG files into a base64 encoded string in your CSS. That doesn't always work very well if you go beyond a fixed number of folders there. So what I typically do to make sure that everything is being served from my /cdn URL, what I typically do there is in my web config, add a URL rewrite rule. So what I do is rewrite my incoming requests whenever they match /cdn/demo2 static and whatever comes next. I just use whatever comes next as the resource URL and rewrite that URL. Probably not the safest way of doing things, because right now I'm also I'm not only rewriting my /css/scripts/whatever URLs, I'm also rewriting my /home/index and so forth. So if you use this approach, be sure to whitelist the URLs that you want to be rewritten and not do something like I did, which is blindly rewriting every request. But just for demos, I'm doing it like this. So let's publish. Let's push a new version to my cloud service. You see I'm using web deploy. That's an approach you can take. I don't know if you're familiar with it. What you can do is configure your cloud service to also support web deploy, that you can really quickly deploy new versions of your site to your cloud service. One caveat there is that your changes are not persistent, so if the machine reboots or gets reimaged or something like that, your content will again be the thing you initially deployed. So this is just for development purposes. But right now, if I go back to my URL, I should be seeing nice CSS and so on. So again, waiting for the resources to load. There we go. So now being served from the CDN. CDN is hitting my /cdn URL on my cloud service. Cloud service is returning that to the CDN, and all the next loads, the resources like CSS, images, and so on, will be loaded from the CDN until my cache expires. Which brings me to the next thing. I didn't really specify any cache control headers for the resources I'm serving in this way. What I can do is specify my cache control headers globally in my web.config. So what I can say is cache everything for 1 hour, and IIS will add my cache control header. CDN will respect the cache control header in its cache as well. If you're using MVC, and for example, you want to cache your index action for 5 hours, what you can do is simply add an output cache attribute there. Say that you want to vary by param whatever you want, and say that the duration equals 60 seconds or whatever you want to put in there. So do influence whatever you want to serve through the CDN, because it matters in terms of being able to refresh the content to the end user. All right, another thing, just as a quick tip, the CDN will serve your content the way it's being served by the cloud service, which means if you do something like this, and I'm just going to uncomment it all so it's a little bit easier to read. When you do something like this, enable HTTP compression and say that you want to serve all your images, all your JavaScript files, all your CSS and so forth in a compressed fashion using gzip. The CDN will download the gzipped version and serve the gzipped version to your client as well. So in terms of minimizing the size of the resources being transferred from the CDN, use HTTP compression as well, because the CDN will also serve up the compressed files, and instead of 20 kilobytes CSS file, maybe serve up a 5 kilobyte CSS file, which is a lot faster to download, and again, overcoming this the speed of light issue. All right. Headers, preferably also content type headers, and content encoding may matter as well. Version your content, and if you want to make use of HTTP compression towards your clients, enable it on your origin, and the CDN will also make use of it. Now, this sounded like a summary of the presentation, right? Well, it's not. What if I told you that you can also serve dynamic content over the CDN? Disclaimer. Dynamic content is not dynamic content that changes for every request or for every single user. With dynamic content, in this case, I mean content that can be cached for several minutes or maybe several hours. Could be that you are generating a website that's displaying a chart of sales in the past week. Well, probably you only want to refresh that every day, so you have the running average of all the past days. Well, that's dynamic content. Maybe you have a resource that's serving up a new JSON file every 5 minutes. Imagine you're the FIFA website and you want to do something related to soccer, and you want to post the scores as a JSON file on the website. Maybe you want to cache that for 1 or 2 minutes on the website. Okay, stats will not be real time, but people will hit the CDN endpoint and your servers can do nothing. They just have to serve it every 2 minutes to the CDN endpoints. Well, every 2 minutes times 29 endpoints in the globe, but still, it's a big difference with serving it directly from the web server. So that's dynamic content in this example. If you do have something that changes every 5 seconds or every second or every request, don't use the CDN there. Maybe you want to use different cloud services with Traffic Manager and do something yourself, because the CDN will not be that optimal in such scenarios. So let's serve some dynamic content. On my web application here, I created this nice little thing called the meme generator, where I can enter a top text and a bottom text. Stop laughing, because you're making me laugh as well. So what I can do there is enter a text. That text will generate something on the server side and serve that thing on the server side. Stop laughing. Serve that thing through the CDN. So let's first look at the code, maybe. So I don't have to look into the audience. Where's my meme controller? There we are. So what I'm doing here is I have several action methods. First one is simply rendering the form that I'm now seeing. Whenever I submit, I'm creating a new identifier for my meme, storing the variables that I passed in, and returning a URL that people can use to serve up the content that I've generated. Now, note that I'm not generating the content here. I'm just storing an identifier and the data that I want to serve. Let's maybe do that. When I peel onions, onions cry. If you have better quotes, feel free to give me them afterwards. Let's generate this thing. This is the second action method, and if we look at the URL now, it's just generated a URL with an ID in there. So this is my URL, nothing fancy in there, and I can share this URL with whoever wants to use it. If you're fast, you can type this code in your browser and hit my endpoint there. Whenever I hit the endpoint, it will actually hit my show endpoint. My show endpoint is taking my identifier, checking if I actually have some data stored. If not, I'm returning a not found. If I do have something in my database, in this case a simple dictionary, but can be a database as well, I can, for example, store that this thing has been hit one time, or I can track some download statistics, or do security, or whatever I want to do there. Whenever that's done, I'm simply redirecting, if I'm not debugging, I'm redirecting to my CDN endpoint, to my /generate endpoint, with the data that I want to make use of. And that thing actually generates an image with the text on top of it. So a lot of redirecting there, but I just want to make sure that I have a URL, I can still track stats and so on. And when I hit this endpoint, I should be able to see the thing that I initially created, served up from the CDN. So whenever I refresh this thing, I don't hit my cloud service again. So any suggestions on more Chuck Norris quotes? Come on. There we are. All right, it's evening, or my jokes are really bad. I think it's evening, yeah. So in conclusion, what have we learned? We've learned why we want to use a CDN, and that's a pretty simple thing. We want to use a CDN because the internet and HTTP and servers and TCP and everything in between is broken. It's 20-year-old. We have a lot of resources running on it. We cannot change that, so we have to find a workaround, which can be a CDN or a similar approach. The Azure CDN is one of those workarounds that you can use based on blob storage or based on cloud services. I assume websites and other endpoints may eventually show up in there. I don't know, but maybe it would make sense. We've seen how we can serve dynamic content from the CDN as well. And if there's something you have to remember when using the CDN, that is version content and set cache control headers.